Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on the role of favourable conservation status in delivering outcomes for nature. As usual, all of the questions will be answered at the end. Please place them in the chat if you have any burning ones and we will sift through them as and when we can. If you have any audio or visual issues, please add them to the chat also and we will try and sort them out as soon as possible. Other than that, have a great webinar. It looks like we have a maximum amount of attendees today, so no pressure there. And I'll hand over to Claire. Claire, off you go.
Okay, yeah, I'm getting lots of warning messages saying no more people are allowed in. I wonder if some of the Science Talk admin folk could just put an email out to apologise to those who are wondering why they can't get in. And we'll have to think about what we do about that. Anyway,
No
it is
problem.
being recorded.
I think we're already on it.
Cool, thank you. Right, so for those of you who have made it, thank you for joining us and welcome to the webinar. And again, for those that don't know me, I am Claire Whitfield and I'm Senior Advisor in JNCC's Nature Conservation Policy and Advice Team, the NCPA team. So I'm really pleased today to be able to welcome Anna Millard and Julie Hanna from Natural England to provide us with a presentation on defining favourable conservation status. Anna and Julie are both based in Natural England's strategy and government advice team, and I'm reliably informed that Anna is the senior responsible officer for favourable conservation status and conservation advice, and Julie is the project manager for defining favourable conservation status project. So before I hand over to them, I want to give a little bit of background and context. So a couple of us from JNCC heard a similar presentation to this from Anna and Julie at the EU Exit Forum back in February, and we thought it would be of interest to a wider audience in JNCC. And similarly, we've also extended this webinar to the CNCBs because they too were very interested in it, and a warm welcome to folk from the country conservation bodies. So at JNCC, a number of us will be familiar with the term favourable conservation status through our work on the Habitats Directive, and quite a few people have had the pleasure or bear the scars of being involved in Article 17 reporting under the directive. And that includes, as many of you will know, it includes an assessment of conservation status of habitats and species listed in the directive. And of course, the achievement of favourable conservation status is an explicit aim in the Habitats Directive, and that is retained now in UK law. But the concept is not unique to the Habitats Directive, of course. And it's worth noting that in 2018 that JNCC and the country conservation bodies published a joint statement on interpreting the concept of FCS, and that looked at the Habitats Directive, but also wider as well. So Anna and Julie will tell us more about what favourable conservation status is, but in my simple terms, I think it just means that habitats and species are maintaining themselves at relevant geographical scales and with good prospects to continue to do so. So the Natural England defining favourable conservation status project started in 2015 with a recognition that the lack of a consistent framework for defining FCS for habitats and species in England was becoming a bigger issue than the complexity of how to define it. The project has developed a methodology for defining FCS, and that's going to be published soon. And Natural England has started to publish FCS definitions for a range of habitats and species. And I gather that alongside this, the project is developing advice to guide local application of the FCS concept. They're embedding FCS into current and emerging policy areas and working with partners to explore practical issues around targets setting at a landscape scale to contribute to national FCS goals, and then considering what achieving FCS for multiple habitats and species in a place might look like. So Julia said that they're keen to work closely with other SNCBs and administrations across the UK to see how FCS can be used to achieve better outcomes for habitats and species across their range, as well as to inform future monitoring and reporting. So it's a really great reason for hearing more about this work today, and to start the dialogue about how even how we can work across the UK on some of these concepts and ideas. So I'll hand over to the presenters, and just to remind you, there'll be questions at the end, so please pop them into the chat, as my colleague has already said. So over to Anna.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Claire. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yep.
Fabulous. That's a fantastic introduction to the project and overview of where we are. Hopefully you can all see the slides. We're going to be going Chris Whitty style, so I'll be instructing Julie to move us on to the next slide. So apologies for the slight clunkiness of that approach, but technical issues. So let's move on to slide 2 there then, please, Julie. That just gives an outline of the talk that we're going to deliver today. So firstly, I'm going to start with where the project is and a little bit of the background to some of the concepts of favourable conservation status. Then we'll move into how we're using that work in Natural England, then setting the context of policy around work that we've been doing, and particularly how it's relating to some of these post-EU exit emerging policy areas. And then finally, I wanted to touch on some of the potential ideas for how we might be able to use the work in the future if we continue to develop it in the way that we hope to be able to do. So slide 3, please, Julie. So Claire mentioned there UK SNCB common statement on FCS that was published by the JNCC in 2018. That really describes FCS as a positively oriented objective for the natural environment, which requires more than avoiding extinctions of species or loss of habitats. FGS is familiar to us as a legal concept. If you, as Claire mentioned, have worked previously with Habitats Directive, but it also is vitally important that one of the key principles that we use when thinking about FCS is that it provides a common purpose for a coherent ecological network. So I really want to talk here about this word thriving, which we use so much when framing our conversations about nature recovery. It's often used as the antithesis to the bare minimum concept of surviving, which can in many ways be more easily defined. But defining what we mean by thriving can be subjective and made up of multiple components, from abundance to range and resilience through to reproductive capability and recruitment in the present time and then into the future. The method that Natural England have developed to define favourable conservation status can provide a significant contribution to this discourse, as it provides an objective framework defined in terms of agreed parameters to determine what favourable conservation status really means. So we're doing this work because in the 40 years since the Bonn Convention, no one's really attempted to describe what favourable conservation status looks like in England for individual habitats and species. So while we're familiar with it as an objective, we've not really had that clarity about what it means in practice. So since 2015, Natural England and partner organisations have increased their focus on the potential benefits of defining favourable conservation status, one outcome of which is the suite of definitions that Natural England are now publishing. Crucially, FCS covers both protected sites and the wider environment. It provides a consistent framework applicable across a range of evidence sources and confidence levels, which can be used to drive outcomes for nature recovery. It's a national ambition, not so much a policy-driven target. Our work focuses on FCS at an England scale, but its applications are scalable. And in the post-EU exit world, where we're seeing shifts towards organisations, particularly the JNCC, taking an active role in governance at a UK level, we can begin to explore the role and contribution that FCS can make to some of this UK level reporting and understanding of what we mean by thriving sustainably. Slide 4, please, Julie. So what is FCS and what is the methodology that Natural England have produced to start answering some of these questions? So it provides us with a robust framework to brigade our best available evidence and define our ambition for nature recovery. setting the minimum threshold at which we would define thriving. So we define SCS in natural England based on 3 parameters. That's natural range and distribution, area of population, structure and function of habitat or supporting habitat. And then for each of these 3 parameters, we look at historic and current range or situations, future maintenance of biological diversity and ecological variation. And then thirdly, we apply constraints to expansion or restoration, which only relate to significant urban areas. Slide 5, please, Julie. So we have currently 80 definitions on our current work programme. You can see here where we are currently. We've got 19 definitions published, and they're available through National England's Access to Evidence website. We've got 44 in progress at the moment, which we are hoping to move over the line and get published this year. So 3/4 of those only require a small amount of work before we progress to the QA stage. We've got a mix of habitats and species. We really looked at, for habitats, commonly occurring priority habitats and those linked to the relevant SAC habitats where appropriate, to give a good coverage for England. In terms of species, we've done a mixture of SAC species, birds, other protected or priority species, and we've selected them because of their importance to species licensing and to provide a really good range of different types of species to test the methodology to make sure that it works for different life histories and real range. So that's how we've selected the programme so far. As I've mentioned, we've got 44 in progress, 3/4 of those almost ready to move on to QA. But we're going to be prioritising the back definitions to support some of the questions that have been coming through around licensing. 2 of these definitions are also complete. So beaver and cormorant are very almost done, but we are aligning that with some other policy outcomes. So we've been getting quite a lot of good press attention around this work. We had over 400 downloads in the first week for the common dormouse definition, and our hedgerow work has been referenced in The Guardian, and several other of our definitions have been picked up through Guardian articles as well. We've got a programme of new definitions that we're working on. You can see the ones that are there on the slide that we're hoping to begin work on this year. We're also very close to publishing a methodology and a technical user information note to sit alongside this library of definitions. Next slide, please, Julie. So as you've seen from the previous slide, we've recently published definitions for 4 of our grassland habitats. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain into the approach that we took to defining SCS for these habitats. The ambition was determined by the Priority Habitat Network, and using this layer of data, we undertook network potential modelling. So these maps then provide an overview of areas where habitat could be restored or created to increase connectivity based on the Lawton model of bigger, better, more joined up. So these models are also used for defining Favourable Conservation Status and as baseline tool in National England's Nature Recovery Network. The total area the models predict for restoration potential then informs the area parameter in our definition of SCS. Where we have, there's an inherent issue that you can see with that, where we may have a geographical area where there is the potential for multiple habitats that could be restored in that place. So what the model does is essentially assign these equally to potential habitats. 19 habitats have been modelled through this network potential modelling method, and they've been sort of combined into a sort of England-wide combined model. There is some uncertainty around the data, particularly from the priority habitat inventory, which is the sort of base layer data set that we use for some of this network modelling. But we do have a programme that's looking to really improve upon that base layer of data. So we really would see this as an ongoing continual improvement exercise. As we improve our mapping system, we will sort of go back and can rerun these models and improve the accuracy of the work that we do. But that's how the basic approach that we take to some of the setting the habitat area metrics. So next slide, please, Julie. I'm going to hand over to Julie now, who's going to take you through some of our work on strategies and partnerships and how we're using some of the work in natural england's delivery.
Thanks very much, Anna. Can I just check that everybody can hear me? Yep, great, thank you. Okay, so Anna has talked about our FCS definitions, which are the documents that present the evidence and metrics for each parameter which we use to define FCS at a national scale. And those are the documents which are produced following the methodology that we're going to publish fairly soon. Whilst that information and evidence is really valuable in its own right, we actually need to do more to make it easy to apply locally. And for that reason, we're planning a series of FCS strategies, which we may end up calling application information or something of the sort, which will take the England level definitions and then try to operationalise them for delivery. We want those strategy documents to be streamlined and easy to use, and we think there'll be an important resource with which to integrate FCS into a wide range of delivery areas, for example, the Nature Recovery Network or local nature recovery strategies, amongst other things. And we envisage that they will include a geographic breakdown, potentially by county or national character area, and also a temporal breakdown, providing, for example, milestones to delivery, including sort of the 25-year plan timescale, which together should help users understand what appropriate local contributions to national FCS goals look like and what they need to start doing to move towards achieving them. We're also starting to consider how we might produce information to support the application of several FCS definitions together in a place, potentially at a landscape scale, which of course is one of the real challenges of this work, to actually provide great information which we can sort of help real situations on the ground to improve their delivery. And the photos on this slide are there really to represent two of the strategies that we're pushing forward first. And the reason for that is because they're linked, very much linked. So Little Turn and Sand Dunes are two of the ones that are quite far on in development. And I'll mention in a few minutes another one that's almost finished. We see this work on strategies as an absolutely vital part of the project for bedding into the Nature Recovery Network and other mechanisms, as I said. But it necessarily comes after the production of definitions, which is why it's sort of it's following on rather than going ahead first. I wanted to mention a little bit about partnership working, because it isn't really possible to talk about our nature recovery ambitions without acknowledging the importance of working with partners. So I just want to briefly mention the partnership working we've been undertaking as part of the project so far, which is in addition to that which we've been doing with DEFRA, and also in addition to the regular briefings that we've done for the statutory nature conservation bodies via the EU Exit Forum. And identifying the right priorities with the right people in the right place is the key to nature recovery success. And FCS is increasingly a key tool in framing those discussions in our joint work. Importantly, many of these partners have a UK or even international perspective. And so whilst they're pleased that Natural England is developing a methodology and the thinking around FCS, they're really keen to see how it can be applied at a UK scale, and also to better understand where JNCC and the other SNCBs are at themselves with FCS. We acknowledge that there isn't one correct way to define FCS. We followed certain principles which are agreed, for example, in the common statement, but there isn't actually a definitive way to define FCS. And so we're working closely with partners like the RSPB, who have been developing their own modelling approach to define FCS. We want to try and refine their method for setting range parameter and to better understand how our respective approaches relate to each other. So that's a piece of work that we will have finished hopefully in a couple of months' time and be ready to share at that point. We've also funded this last year a member of staff from Bat Conservation Trust to work on data collation for in order to enable us to produce definitions for 5 bat species which commonly occur in species licensing. And we're also working closely with amphibian and reptile conservation across a number of areas relating to FCS, particularly around the question of how to use FCS strategies at a local level. All of these partners on the slide are involved with an FCS case study, which I'll come to discuss a little bit more in a minute. So on to a few words about how we think we can probably use FCS definitions and strategies. And one of the main areas is species licensing. The evidence that we generate in FCS definitions can be supplied to colleagues working on species licensing and can be really helpful to inform the context of the derogations they have to consider ahead of licenses being issued. So I just want to briefly talk you through 4 examples, which are quite early examples of how FCS is being used, but probably illustrate different points which is worth being aware of. So the first here is great crested newts, and many of you will be aware of the district level licensing for great crested newts that Natural England has been involved in, and which has really developed over a similar time frame to our FCS project. And district level licensing has had the objective of contributing to the achievement of FCS at its heart from the outset. And the FCS test that's undertaken before each county scheme is permitted draws on the principles we've developed for defining FCS, which helps to provide consistency between district level licensing schemes. Our great crested newt definition hasn't actually been published yet, but it should be available fairly soon. Because we're actually currently considering new population estimates which have been generated from the data that's been collected by the district level licensing project itself. So we need to factor that in or consider if and how it can be used before we publish that definition. The second one here is buzzard. In 2015, Natural England lost a judicial review related to buzzard licensing, which is the McMahon judicial review. And so at that point, we were anticipating a potential increase in the number of buzzard licence applications that we may receive. And so we instigated a piece of work with BTO to undertake abundance modelling based on the parameters in our FCS definition. That modelling can greatly improve the accuracy of the licensing FCS test, because it makes it possible to determine the impact on FCS of removing a given number of birds from each 10-kilometre grid square of the model. Actually, the increase in buzzard licence application hasn't materialised. There's been sort of a steady trickle of them, but no great increase, which is quite a relief, I think. But as and when these do come in, we've got improved evidence available to use whenever we need to, which is quite a big step forward for that species. The next one is peregrine. This time last year, you might have seen media coverage relating to Natural England licensing a small group of falconers to take 6 birds from the wild for breeding purposes. Our FCS definition for peregrine was used by our high-risk casework panel in their consideration of that particular case. Peregrine have increased significantly in England in recent years, but the high-risk casework panel found the definition of FCS extremely useful to enable them to direct the locations of the licensing towards areas where the population would be most resilient, rather than areas where we felt that there was still the potential to expand the population. Then the final example relates to licenses to introduce beaver to England. The FCS project contributed funding to some habitat suitability modelling done for us by Exeter University the other year, and that's informed an FCS definition and also the first of our FCS strategies. The definition is going to be published as part of DEFRA's public consultation on the management of beavers in the wild and a national approach to further releases. And we're expecting that public consultation to happen in the fairly near future. So it's really interesting in this case to note the value of definitions and strategies for reintroductions, not just the species that we've already got. That particular strategy is the first that we've completed. It's not going to be published alongside the public consultation, but really interesting that it can be used in a forward-looking way for species that we may want to reintroduce. One additional point to make in relation to licensing is to do with the cost saving to Natural England from the project. Whilst this wasn't one of the original drivers, it's been one of the outcomes, and we're increasingly viewing the project as an investor save model. By brigading specialist knowledge and setting that in a national context, we can manage down specialist input to reactive casework, which is really, really helpful. And we hope that this trend will continue as we publish more definitions. I'll come back to the issue that I mentioned at the end of the partnership working slide, which is that we are starting to develop a case study in the Purbeck Heaths. And it's really important that a project doesn't just develop evidence and policy around use of FCS, but actually turns it into something that can improve delivery on the ground. And so one element of that delivery side of our work is this new proof of concept pilot study, which we're developing with the partners that were mentioned on the previous slide, and particularly with ARC taking a key role in that. The aim of the project is to demonstrate how FCS can be used in a place to inform delivery of nature recovery outcomes, to investigate what an appropriate local contribution to national FCS might look like, and then how that can inform local target setting, particularly for species, but also for habitats as well. And we really hope that that can be useful in the context of our nature recovery network and local nature recovery strategies. Interestingly, that pilot will consider species and habitats for which we already have developed a national FCS definition, but also those where we don't have that evidence available, recognising that it won't be possible for us to produce a definition for everything. And so we need to have some principles there to guide our work where we don't have a definition in place. It's going to consider how to use multiple definitions together in a place, and other issues such as whether managing for habitats will also provide sufficiently for species. We've held an initial workshop for that piece of work, which initiated the pilot, and we're hoping to continue working with those partners throughout this next year to hopefully deliver some outcomes which can be informative, particularly for our strategies, I think, and how we embed FCS into our work more generally. I'm going to hand back to Anna now for the next slide.
That's great. Thanks very much, Julie. So I'm going to just talk about the last aspect of how we're using the work, and this is a really major one for us, and it's about how can we embed some of these outcomes that we're discovering through the FCS project into our protected sites conservation advice. So for anybody that's not aware, conservation advice is the detailed site-based evidence given by Natural England, and crucially in the offshore by the JNCC. So the offshore MCZ, JNCC takes this the same role that we would do within 12 nautical miles and terrestrially. And conservation advice describes the features and attributes of SACs, SPAs and MCZs, and sort of describes what makes up site integrity. And then this advice is used to inform on the impacts of plans or projects to that overall integrity. So very useful to us in casework delivery. Previous legal advice has suggested that it is possible to amend site conservation objectives to take account of a national view of FCS for habitats and species. So we are looking at, in 2021, trials to see how can we use this information that is coming out of the FCS definitions, how can we turn that information into something that useful evidence that we could use in our feature frameworks. So they're the generic frameworks that sit under our conservation advice and in our bespoke conservation advice packages. So in our conservation advice standard, we state that we will ensure over time individual site conservation objectives better reflect strategic objectives and priorities which may be set for the European site network. It then goes on to say, when favourable conservation status can be fully reflected at a site level, we'll refine the content of those conservation objectives, which have been set for individual sites to better outline their contribution to these strategic aims. So really clear there that an objective of this work is that we need to ensure that any of these outcomes and directions that come through defining favourable conservation status at a national level are then reflected in what we're saying throughout the protected sites network. So there are some scenarios where we might want to look at our conservation objectives. So particularly if we've identified an increasing population or habitat extent targets above the current baseline and what could be predicted through natural fluctuation. We've also asked whether we can amend conservation objectives to set restoration targets in light of new information, which we're now sort of testing out to see. Do we have the paucity of evidence to undertake that? So we're currently testing embedding of FCS into all sites with little turn and sand dune features. So by embedding it FCS, we're able to ensure that we have a consistency of approach between our advice products, but we can also begin to think about what is required to achieve national FCS and the relative contribution of the protected sites network to that overall defined ambition. The importance of protected sites for achieving FCS will vary by feature type, but we can set the context of what we want to achieve and identify the routes towards achieving this by bedding these two pieces of information together. So quantified targets such as those for population abundance and extent provide figures on how sites currently contribute to the achievement of FCS. The population abundance at the time of designation is used in the majority of cases to set that target unless we've otherwise agreed by the chief scientist. So we then set restore or maintain trajectories which give an indication of whether a site is making a full contribution to FCS or whether recovery is required within that site. Current population figures are often included for context. What conservation advice tells us is that the total contribution towards FCS within protected sites, if all sites were in favourable condition, as well as considering temporal factors that show us what that site's contribution is at this current moment in time. So here I'll just walk you through, this is a very, very simplified example, but just to sort of illustrate the context and what the way that we're thinking about this. So you'll see on the slide there, we've got a picture of a little tern. We have set national FCS at 2,000 pairs, but we know that if we add up all of the pairs that are notified within protected sites network, that comes to 1,514 pairs. So we know that 15 of those SPAs are not meeting their condition targets for breeding pair abundance. So they are in a recover trajectory. But the national FCS work tells us that even if all of those sites were achieving a maintained trajectory, we would still need another 486 pairs to achieve what we've considered to be national FCS, so England's contribution to FCS. So how can we deliver this? We can look at recovery within sites, directing conservation of efforts to those sites more likely to achieve results, and looking for opportunities outside of protected sites. So I've been really calling this idea the nature recovery gap. And this is where the FCS work can be really fundamental to help inform our outcomes and our delivery. So once sites have reached favourable condition, there may be an opportunity through national guidance and local conversations to determine whether there's then further capacity for restoration within these sites to contribute further towards our goal of achieving FCS. And it can really set the framework for those conversations and set that ambition level. A really clear conclusion from our trial is that the FCS strategies that Julie was referring to earlier are going to play a really vital role in informing embedding into conservation advice. The strategy is effectively an action plan of how we want to deliver FCS for a given habitat or species, and different geographical scales are used in the trial strategy as compared to the definition. So this lends itself to the finer resolution of protected sites, even if the scale of assessment is different. So we see that conservation advice and favourable conservation status working together in dynamic feedback loops to continually drive improvements in each product and ultimately improve our advice and decision making on protected sites. Next slide, please, Julie. So I'm not going to dwell too long on this one. I just hope we wanted to illustrate here what the scale of embedding SCF across different work areas looks like. So you can see we move on the bottom there from a site level where we're talking about drivers of local site objectives, conservation advice being the mechanism, and the outcomes feeding into monitoring and CSM for triple SIs. And then you kind of move up that scale trajectory into local and regional conservation policy, where our definitions fit, national objectives, and national biodiversity policy. We've illustrated there the sort of English mechanisms that we're hoping to bed some of this work into to help drive us towards those outcomes. And you can see there from the arrows how we see they are linked to one another and how the FCS definitions feed in across multiple scales to those different mechanisms and drivers. Next slide, please, Julie. So we've introduced through this talk how we can use the concept of SCS to develop a framework for defining thriving plants and wildlife, habitats and species even. To achieve this, we need to think about how we can embed these ambitions across the relevant policy landscape. The new nature strategy can offer us a fantastic opportunity to do that. And we can look at some of the outcomes from the Environment Bill and Environment Bill indicators and nature recovery networks and local nature recovery schemes. So these are very England-specific policy areas. But I think really interesting for this audience is to think much more widely than that. So on to the next slide, please, Julie. So this slide really deals with some of the questions that have been emerging around cross-border assessments and how might we in the UK use this idea of SCS and how might it feed into some of these emerging post-EU exit areas where we have some freedom to think about the way that we want to take our work forward. So I've called this section Lessons from the Cormorant because it raised some quite interesting questions for us when we undertook the definition for SCS in cormorant at the England level. So there are two subspecies of cormorant found in England. One is coastal and one is a European subspecies which has been increasing mainly inland and also crucially breeds inland. These two subspecies both exist in England and naturally licensed shooting of a certain number of these protect fisheries. Licenses, however, are issued in the winter when it can be quite difficult to distinguish between those subspecies. There's the possibility that some of the Welsh birds overwinter in England, and we really need to understand more about cross-border movements and the relationship between English and Welsh relative contributions to achieving FCS so that we can direct effective conservation management. So some really interesting questions coming up there about, what do we do with these mobile species that are present across borders? So one of the other areas that would be really quite fruitful way to think about applying this FCS work is to think about future reporting. So since we left the EU, we have been, as part of the Conservation of Habitats and Species Amendment from 2019, Regulation 9A states that within 6 years from exit day and at least every 6 years thereafter, the appropriate authority must publish in such form as it sees fit a report on the implementation of the measures taken for the purpose of giving effect to the provisions of the directives and the achievements of the objectives as set out in Article 2 of the Habitats Directive and 2 and 3 of the new Wild Birds Directive. My goodness, that is a mouthful. So essentially what we're talking about here is what is the reporting scheme that replaces Article 17 and Article 12. And we really think that SCS could have quite a valuable role to play here if we're able to define what is an appropriate contribution to SCS at a UK level. How could we then build that into a future reporting framework and if we're able to do that, is that going to be perhaps a more useful way of viewing some of our reporting work and directing conservation action as a result of it? I've put on here as well another sort of idea that I think would be quite useful, is to look at the English and Scottish seabird strategies and how we might be able to use FCS in the context of joining up those strategies. If we're able to have a unified, essentially, it's not an ambition. If we are able to define a UK level ambition for those species within the English and Scottish strategies, we could unify some of the outcomes and ensure that those strategies are working towards the same goal. So next slide, please, Julie. So I really just wanted to make a quick point before moving on to this one. The FCS work is very much marine and terrestrial. We've talked about some terrestrial habitats here, and talking about grasslands, but we're very much in Natural England are viewing this as a marine and terrestrial work area, and we've been producing definitions for marine habitats and species as well as terrestrial ones. So that sort of then brings us on to this final slide, where I wanted to end our talk today, just with a future look to what is the biggest looming challenge facing us all as nature conservation bodies, and of course it is climate change. And to really think about how could some of our FCS work help us frame some of this future decision making. So we've talked here in detail about some of the challenges of defining FCS under current scenarios, but of course we're very aware of the rapid changes occurring around us and the need to plan now for climate-related shifts in habitats and species distribution. Our FCS definitions have been based on the current climate scenario, but by their nature, they contain a wealth of relevant information, which will be really integral to forward planning decisions. And we're just beginning to think about how we might link some of these ideas. So the framework on this slide has been developed by Andrew Twelves while working with the JNCC, and he's been particularly working on migratory species, and he's intended this framework as a guide to efficient use of resources by focusing on the most appropriate strategy for different species. So I saw Andrew give a presentation on his work last week, so many thanks for that, Andrew, if you are on the call today. And it's a great talk that really sparked some interesting ideas for us as a project. He's developed some international case studies around this framework, but what really struck me was how much of the information required for this decision making is already available through our defining FCS work. So I think a really fruitful line of inquiry between NE and the JNCC and any other country agencies that would be interested would be to look at testing this framework out for species where we've developed an England level definition of FCS. And we're really keen to begin a dialogue on how we could look at joining these work areas and selecting some test species to trial this method with. So that brings us to the end of the areas that we wanted to cover today. As you can see, defining FCS is at once a challenging and fruitful work area, but I hope we've been able to illustrate the strides that Natural England has been making in pushing this work area forward. One thing that we've really learned as we delve deeper into this work is the more that we do, the more potential we see to link what we're doing with emerging policy and some of the big questions facing us as organisations. So I'd really like to thank Claire and the JNCC Science Talks team for inviting us along today, and to Julie for contributing to this talk as well. And I'd really like us then to open the floor to questions. The FCS work is at once fascinating and challenging because it covers so many different work areas. It is relevant to all sorts of different things, so I really hope that this group have got some interesting questions for us. So let's just go through the photo credits now, Julie, and then on to the last slide, and we'll open the floor for questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that. That was a really interesting talk. We've had quite a few questions pop up on the chat, so I'll just try and get as many of them gone through. We've got about 12 minutes for questions. So first one is, do you involve others externally in developing the definition, so such as academics or NGOs?
We do, yes, absolutely. I mean, it sort of varies a bit between definitions. Julie mentioned there that who's Lucy? We don't even have anyone called Lucy. That Conservation Trust have been developing five of the commonly occurring bat species. We're working very closely with the RSPB. We contract out a lot of the data collation contract for these definitions. So we tend to try and pick the national experts on these topics, and they can be academics, they can be from consultancies. So yes, we definitely do. So we get the data collation from those people, and then we look at them internally with our own national specialists. So yeah, we absolutely take a broad church of views. Is there anything you want to add to that, Julie?
Yeah, and for most of the definitions, they will also go to an external reviewer before the as part of the QA process before they're published, and those would tend to be sort of nationally acknowledged experts in the field.
Perfect, thank you very much. Next question is, having developed the FCS definitions, can you explain if and how these will influence the Natural England monitoring strategies and programmes?
Oh, great question. Yes, we hope that it will. So we've already been feeding in so there's the NCEA, apologies, monitoring frameworks being developed. One of the things that we've really identified in the work that we do is that we're quite able to identify evidence gaps through our framework. And so that has been something that we've been then feeding into other areas of Natural England. So we've undertaken a review of all of the definitions that we've published so far and identified those areas where we've perhaps struggled with some parameters because of evidence gaps, and we then sort of feed that back into the monitoring frameworks. So yeah, we're very much trying to sort of work closely and feed that information in as it comes through.
Great, perfect. Next question, someone said, I imagine there'll be a level of uncertainty in the recovery gap you described between national FCS and site contributions. So the question is, how do you communicate this to stakeholders to inform or support discussion around conservation measures?
Yeah, another great question. Of course there is. And I think, it's really important here that we reiterate that our SCS definitions are describing an ambition. They're not a policy-driven target. So, while that's a very simplistic view that I put up there, sort of talking about Middleton and 2000, and the gap is exactly 416, and that gives sort of almost an over impression of the level of accuracy that we're able to do. But as we know, working in this field, we very rarely have that level of accurate information. So it's really all about how we communicate locally and how we communicate with our stakeholders. And I think, it's absolutely vital that we ensure that anything that we put forward or that we suggest is part of a locally driven solution, and that the partnerships that we work in will always be the main drivers for nature recovery. And that's really sort of one of the core principles of the Nature Recovery Network that Natural England is developing. It has to be about guiding sort of what our decisions might look like in a place. And it's about, ensuring that we are honest when we don't know. And we don't have that accuracy of information, and that we're very clear about just making sure we define favourable conservation status as an ambition. And it's very much, I call it the floor, not the ceiling. So, you know, it's a level at which we would want to see thriving sustainably. So there's a lot of conversations we can have around that topic about what's appropriate in a place, and making sure that sort of any outcomes are from the bottom up, because that's the way they're going to be most effective. Julie, do you want to add to anything?
I was going to just to add a little bit to that. Yeah, what you said then, Anna, about bottom-up deliveries is absolutely true, and I think we shouldn't see it as a sort of a top-down ambition versus a bottom-up delivery. We need to. It's far more fluid than that. So we're sort of providing the framework or the guide to the level of ambition that's needed to be delivered, rather than setting that target. But when you come to delivery on the ground, it's going to be iterative. We're not going to have all the solutions now. And so even if we have a fair idea of what the nature recovery gap is, we might not have got the ability or the funding or the mechanisms or whatever to fill it right now. So it's going to be iterative. We're going to have to do things now, reconsider, review, monitor, and then work out what else is needed, and gradually put different mechanisms in place till eventually we move as far towards FCS as we possibly can. Acknowledging that in some cases we might not be able to, certainly not in the short term, probably not in the long term. And I think the documents that we produce, particularly strategies, will help with some of this informing people about what we think the gap is. But there's a need to make sure those are live and keep them updated on the basis of new information as it comes in.
Great, thanks for that. That was a really detailed, informed answer. Next question is just, what is your plan regarding marine mammals across the UK?
Yes, well, we have, we've done Harbour Porpoise, haven't we?
Yeah.
Already. So, you know, please do look that one up. What else have we got on the agenda? I'm not sure.
We haven't.
No,
we haven't. And certainly from an England perspective, the SAC features, I'm thinking right in saying it would only be grey seal. I don't think bottlenose dolphin is on any of our SACs. So it's a limited choice if we were to focus just on England. Obviously, if other parts of the UK wanted to join in, great, we can do more.
Great, thank you.
To share that Harbour Porpoise definition. If anyone's interested, please do just drop us an email, and you know, happy to share everything that we've done so far.
Perfect, thank you. I think this question you might have touched upon, but I'll read it out anyway. With climate change, there seems to be a general shift of species climatic envelopes to the north. So how will the FCS work for England and take account of these anticipated changes?
Shall I pick that one up first, Anna? Or...
Yeah, I was just going to say, you do it. We really sort of touched on that with Dartford Warbler, didn't we? So yeah, Julie.
Yeah, I mean, essentially the definitions at the moment, for some quite valid reasons, focus on the current climate scenario. And if you want to know more about why, when we get a methodology document published, it's all outlined in there. I think what we would need to do then is to factor in potential climate changes when we come to actually delivery, and that means in the strategies we can talk more about it, and look ahead to what might be needed to ensure that we maintain FCS or continue to work towards it into the future, given likely changes. But yeah, the definitions as they stand at the moment are based on the current scenario.
Great, thank you. We've got about 4 minutes, so probably about 2 more questions. So we'll go with who will take what sort of action against whom if FCS is not achieved?
Great question. Depends how. Depends how it gets bedded in to the emerging policy areas. Really. It's a difficult one to answer, isn't it? I think we're not really sort of at that stage. Julie, do you want to go?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, I mean, I think whilst it's a legal concept, it's such, as the way in which FCS is defined it means it's such a long-term objective that it's very difficult to turn it into something which is, excuse me, which is anything that you could take very clear action on, unless you've got a really clear-cut case of something being really seriously damaged by a piece of casework of whatever sort that might be. So I would imagine, yes, it will be, as always, as it is already, it will be a factor in sort of development casework or species licensing even. But then in terms of achievement overall, there's no timescales associated with that, and it is very much described as an ambition rather than anything that it would be very easy to sort of challenge or take action against. I don't know, do you think that's right, Anna?
Yeah, and I think it's really, really fundamental to remember that the FCS test is absolutely sort of vital part of derogations for species licensing. So it's assessed through that mechanism, and any action which contravened what was agreed as part of that process would be subject to come back through those regular regulatory processes, and again, to do with the Transposed Habitats Directive. All of that is still in place. So FCS as a legal concept is very much sort of bedded within protected sites and bedded within our licensing. So what then happens outside of that? I think we have the mechanism for assessing plans and projects and their impact. So there are mechanisms in place. I think there is more work to do as we see all these emerging policy areas coming out. So I think it's really interesting to look at things like protected site strategies and species conservation strategies coming out of the Environment Bill. And we're working very hard to try and get that concept of SCS really bedded in to those. And so as those policy areas emerge, we would sort of like to see more mechanisms that be available to us for helping us achieve SCS for habitats and species.
Great, thank you. Well, it's bang on 2 o'clock, so I'll probably leave it there, but I'm assuming that if people have got any other questions, they can just contact the emails on the slide at the moment.
Yes, please.
Yes, please,
we do
by all
have
means.
a project mailbox actually as well, don't we?
Yeah, which I've forgotten.
Oh, no,
Yes, it's defining.
Email us.
I think it's defining favourable conservation status at naturalengland.org.uk, but I can confirm that and get that circulated out. And also, if there are any other questions that came in, if any other questions came in on the chat, we can address them by email if that would be appropriate.
Perfect. Well, yeah, I'll leave it there. So thank you to all the speakers and all the attendees. Apologies for anyone that didn't manage to get in. We're trying to work out a way that we can share this to as many people as possible. But yeah, hope everyone has a nice afternoon.
Wonderful. Thanks very much for inviting us along. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.